All right, when we left off, we were talking about the father of history, Herodotus. Down here in the bottom left, Herodotus, the father of history. And one of the things that we talked about in the last week when you read the article about Herodotus was whether he could be an objective historian. And particularly, we were talking about Herodotus being an objective historian with regards to war between the Greeks, which are over here on this peninsula, and the Persians, which made up this massive empire. And so today we're going to talk about the Persian Empire. And I want you to keep in mind as we talk about the Persian Empire and the Persian Wars, which are the wars between Persia and the Greeks, that Herodotus wrote the history in part that we're going to look at. So we'll just keep in mind whether we felt like he could be an objective source to this or not. He wrote a good deal of the history that is documented about these wars. So a little bit about Persia before we start. So first of all, remember we have been always referring back to that Indo-European group that came from the Caucasus area and flew down into or migrated down into these different areas. And we've talked about so many different groups, and I told you that we were going to talk about the Greeks, which we have been, but then we are also going to talk about the Medes that were in this area and the Persians, which were in this area. So that's what we're going to pick up today with how did this empire get to be like this? So the Persians were an Indo-European people who lived in what is today, southwestern Iran. So in this area right in here. They're primarily nomadic, just like most of those early Indo-European tribes. The Persians over time organized themselves into groups until one family managed to unify most of them. One of the family members, Cyrus, created a really powerful Persian state that stretched from Asia Minor, which is here, all the way to Western India, over here. Cyrus, who's right there, ruled from 559 BCE to about 530 BCE. And in 539 BCE, he entered Mesopotamia, he captured Babylon, and his treatment of the Babylonian people showed a lot of remarkable restraint and wisdom. Cyrus issued an edict permitting the Jews who had been brought to Babylon in the 6th century to return to Jerusalem, also places that we've been talking about. So he allowed the Jews to go back to Jerusalem. He allowed them to rebuild their temple there, the temple that we talked about was so important. The people of this time called Cyrus the Great. Indeed, he might have been a pretty unusual ruler for his time because he was a man who demonstrated a lot of wisdom and compassion in his conquest and his organization of this empire. Cyrus had a reputation for mercy. Medes, Babylonians, and Jews all accepted him as their leader. Cyrus had genuine respect for other civilizations. In building his palaces, for example, he used Assyrian, Babylonian, and Egyptian designs in his own building methods. Cyrus's successors extended the territory of the Persian Empire. He had a son named Cambyses, who successfully invaded Egypt, and Darius, who ruled from 529 to 486 BCE, and he added a new Persian province in western India and extended beyond the Indus River Valley. He moved into Europe, conquering Thrace and creating the largest empire the world has ever seen. Darius's contact with the Greeks led him to undertake an invasion of the Greeks, which is how we get involved in this story. Really quickly, a couple of other things to just know about the Persian Empire, and you're going to learn about them in a variety of ways today. They organized this massive empire into 20 different satraps, they're called. 20 different provinces that were led by satraps. And each province was led by the satrap is kind of like a governor. And it's literally translated as the protector of the kingdom. The satrap, or the governor of these 20 provinces, was responsible for collecting taxes, providing justice and security, and recruiting soldiers for this massive Persian army. In addition to this organizational administrative system, they also had something called the Royal Road. It stretched all the way from Lydia to Susa, and it set up way stations that provided food and shelter and fresh horses for the king's messengers, and it allowed him to communicate all around this massive empire and also allowed for movement of troops. Okay. Before we start that, I'm going to let little video intro. Here we go.
This is Crash Course World History, and today we're going to do some legitimate comp civ for those of you into that kind of thing. Stan, I can't help but feel that we have perhaps too many globes. That's better. Today we're going to learn about the horrible totalitarian Persians and the saintly democracy-loving Greeks. But of course, we already know this story. There were some wars in which no one wore any shirts and everyone was reasonably fit. The Persians were bad. The Greeks were good. Socrates and Plato are awesome. The Persians didn't even philosophize. The West is the best. Go team! Yeah, well, no. Let's start with the Persian Empire, which became the model for pretty much all land-based empires throughout the world, except for, wait for it, the Mongols. Much of what we know about the Persians and their empire comes from an outsider writing about them, which is something we now call history. And one of the first true historians was Herodotus, whose famous book, The Persian Wars, talks about the Persians quite a bit. Now, the fact that Herodotus was Greek is important because it introduces us to the idea of historical bias, but more on that in a second. So the Persian Achaemenid dynasty, Achaemenid? Hold on.
Achaemenid or Achaemenid.
They're both right? I was right twice? Right, so the Persian Achaemenid or Achaemenid dynasty was founded in 539 BCE by King Cyrus the Great. Cyrus took his nomadic warriors and conquered most of Mesopotamia, including the Babylonians, which ended a sad period in Jewish history called the Babylonian exile, thus ensuring that Cyrus got great press in the Bible. But his son Darius I was even greater. He extended Persian control east to our old friend the Indus Valley, west to our new friend Egypt, and north to Crash Course newcomer Anatolia. By the way, there were Greeks in Anatolia called Ionian Greeks who will become relevant shortly. So even if you weren't Persian, the Persian Empire was pretty dreamy. For one thing, the Persians ruled with a light touch, like conquered kingdoms were allowed to keep their kings and their elites as long as they pledged allegiance to the Persian king and paid taxes, which is why the Persian king was known as the King of Kings. Plus, taxes weren't too high, and the Persians improved infrastructure with better roads, and they had this Pony Express-like mail service, of which Herodotus said, "They are stayed neither by snow, nor rain, nor heat, nor darkness, from accomplishing their appointed course with all speed." And the Persians embraced freedom of religion, like they were Zoroastrian, which has a claim to be the world's first monotheistic religion. It was really Zoroastrianism that introduced us to the good-evil dualism we all know so well, you know, God and Satan, or Harry and Voldemort. But the Persians weren't very concerned about converting people of the empire to their faith. Plus, Zoroastrianism forbids slavery, and so slavery was almost unheard of in the Persian Empire. All in all, if you had to live in the 5th century BCE, the Persian Empire was probably the best place to do it. Unless, that is, you believe Herodotus and the Greeks. We all know about the Greeks: architecture, philosophy, literature. The very word music comes from Greek, as does so much else in contemporary culture. Greek poets and mathematicians and architects and philosophers founded a culture that we still identify with, and they introduced us to many ideas, from democracy to fart jokes. And the Greeks gave the West our first dedicated history. They gave us our vocabulary for talking about politics. Plus, they gifted us our idealization of democracy, which comes from the government they had in Athens. Mr. Green! Mr. Green! Mr. Green! Mr. Green! Did you say fart jokes? Oh, you don't ask about Doric, Ionian, or Corinthian columns. You don't ask about Plato's allegory of the cave. It's all scatological humor with you. It's time for the open letter? Whip.
Okay, so as you guys can see from listening to John Green, the history that we're going to talk about, we know, is very likely pretty biased. When we looked at the numbers for the Persian Wars when they're fighting against the Greeks, it's difficult to believe. However, we're going to do our best to work our ways through it. So the Persian Empire was growing in its vastness at the same time that the Greeks are kind of coming of age. So they're right there on the outskirts of the Persian Empire, and they're growing in their strength as well. So today we're going to talk about how the two meet and what happens. So, danger of a Helot revolt led Sparta to become a highly militaristic Greek city state. If you listened carefully to the previous lesson about warring city states, you will know that that's the case. So, whereas Athens was developing its kind of democratic principles and focused on art and literature, Sparta was working on figuring out how to develop a well disciplined army to defend itself. So that Sparta was a military state, and struggles between rich and poor led Athens to become a democracy instead. The danger of an outside force, though, helped to unite the two together to fight off the mighty Persians. Okay, so here we go. A new kind of army forms. During the Dorian Age, only the rich were actually able to afford bronze spears, shields, breastplates, chariots. So only the rich served in armies. The Iron Age, which came along, replaced bronze in the manufacture of weapons. Harder than bronze, iron was more common, and they were able to create it for cheaper. So soon, ordinary citizens were able to afford to arm and defend themselves. So the shift from the bronze into the iron weaponry made possible a new kind of army that was composed not just of the rich, but of anyone, merchants, artisans, small landowners. The foot soldiers of this army were called hoplites, and they stood side by side, holding a spear in one hand and a shield in the other. And their fearsome formation was known as the phalanx. It became the most powerful fighting force in the ancient world for a time. So a hoplite is the individual soldier, and the phalanx is the formation. Now, at different points in history, this grid-like square of men was different in size. So sometimes you'll hear that they were 12 by 12 or 10 by 10. But this formation arranged in size, but the formation itself, the way that this organization was supposed to work, it stayed in place. So when the Persian Empire expanded under Cyrus the Great's sons, they expanded into this territory here. Now, here's the thing. When we were talking about ancient Greece before, we were talking about how in some cases, those city-states weren't able to sustain themselves, and they had to go off and colonize. And I said later on, this is going to be important. So some of the city-states here on the Greek peninsula, on the Peloponnesus, had created colonies, and a couple of the colonies were over here. Oops, I want to go back. Over here on the edge of Asia Minor. So we've been in Asia Minor or Anatolia for a few of our historical stories. And right over here, there were a couple of colonies. This is called the Ionian Peninsula here. And this is where some Greek colonies were. So when the Persian Empire expanded, they expanded to control some of these colonies. And when they did, the colonies of Greece said, hey, the Persian Empire is starting to take over. They called for help. And the way that the Greeks got engaged in this whole process was some of the Greek city-states decided to try to go help their colonial outpost here, who had just been taken over by the Persians. So that's where it all starts. The Persian Wars between Greece and the Persian Empire began in Ionia, which was on the coast of Anatolia. The Greeks had long been settled there, but around 546 BCE, the Persians conquered that area. And when the Ionian Greeks revolted against that and asked for help, Athens sent ships and soldiers to their aid. The Persian king, Darius the Great, who was one of the grandson, actually, of Cyrus the Great, defeated the rebels and then vowed to destroy Athens in revenge for getting involved. So in 490 BCE, a Persian fleet carrying, now some of these numbers are according to Herodotus, just FYI, a Persian fleet carried about 25,000 men across the Aegean Sea and landed northeast of Athens, the city-state of Athens, on a plain called Marathon. They landed there in order to kind of stage their attack on Athens. There were about 10,000 Athenians that were arranged in those phalanx formations that we just talked about. Vastly outnumbered, the Greek soldiers charged, and the Persians, who wore light armor and lacked training to fight against the phalanx, were just no match for the disciplined Greek military strategy. After several hours, the Persians fled the battlefield. The Persians lost more than 6,000 men, and in contrast, the Athenian casualties numbered fewer than 200. Now, again, I want to remind you that those numbers come from the history that Herodotus wrote. So when the Persian army that was planning on attacking Athens is defeated on that plain, which is about 26 miles away from Athens, Athens knows, or the troops that have come there to fight against the Persians, they know that probably these Persians are now going to head right to the city-state of Athens. And so they want to get word there super fast in order to tell the Athenians what has happened. So that's what leads to this next series of events. So they choose from amongst them all a good runner. His name is Phidippides. Though the Athenians won the battle, their city was now standing defenseless and didn't know, the news. According to tradition, army leaders chose a young runner named Phidippides to race back to Athens. He brought news of the Persian defeat so that the Athenians would not give up the city without a fight and to be even more prepared. So he ran 26 miles from Marathon, the plain of Marathon, all the way back to Athens, delivering the message. Supposedly, he said, according to tradition, "Rejoice, we conquer," and he then collapsed and died. Moving rapidly from Marathon, the Greek army arrived in Athens not long after. When the Persians sailed into the harbor, they found the city heavily defended. They quickly put to sea and retreated. So Phidippides is the historical reason for marathons that are run today. And the marathon race is 26.2 miles, which measures the distance that Phidippides supposedly ran back in the day. And actually, that's not quite extremely accurate. I think that the length was around 26 miles, but there was a little bit more added to the end because at one point, the British royalty were watching the end of a marathon, and they wanted the marathon to end like right in front of their seats. And so they're like the last mile or so that's run in a marathon is historically set because it got elongated just a little bit historically so that the race would end in front of the king's and queen's seats. And so supposedly like at the tail end of the race, there's a point at which runners yell, "God save the queen," because they're running that last little bit for the freaking queen that decided it was necessary. Oh, come on. Okay, I'm going to try to get that to work later on, darn it. Okay, so at this point, the Persians have been defeated at Marathon and have retreated because they realized that the city has been organized against them, and they just decided it isn't worth continuing on. So they retreat. However, it's a thorn in the side of the Persians that way over here on the very edges of their empire that they were kind of challenged by a small little podunk place like Greece, and they hadn't been successful. So this kind of is something that is just sitting and bugging the Persian leaders. So 10 years later, in 480 BCE, Darius the Great's son, Xerxes is now the leader of the Persian Empire. And supposedly Darius was so frustrated by the fact that the Persians had been defeated at Marathon that he made his son promise that someday he would go and get revenge. Now, who knows if that part of the story is true, but regardless, 10 years later, Xerxes, who is the new leader of the Persian Empire, decides that he is going to go and get revenge. So Xerxes assembles supposedly an enormous invasion force to crush Athens. The Greeks were really badly divided at this point. Some city-states agreed to fight with the Persians because there was so much dissension on the Greek peninsula at this point. Others thought it was wiser to let Xerxes destroy Athens and just return home. Some Greeks even fought with the Persians. Consequently, Xerxes' army met with little resistance as they marched down the coast of Greece. So in 480 BC, the Persians launched this new invasion of Greece. There's a lot of conflict at this point about the Athenians being able to organize all the Greek forces because of the way, in part, Athens has treated the rest of the Greek city-states. We'll get to that in a little bit. But anyway, on their way to Athens, the Greeks are drawn into this mountain pass called Thermopylae, or at Thermopylae. The Greeks, including 300 Spartans, blocked the way. Xerxes assumed that his troops would easily push the Greeks aside. After all, he had tens of thousands of soldiers on his side, and the Greeks had managed, maybe around 7,500. Again, the numbers are Herodotus. Xerxes assumed that his troops would easily push the Greeks aside. However, he underestimated their fighting ability. The Greeks stopped the Persian advance for 3 days. Only a traitor informing the Persians about a secret path around the mountain pass ended the brave stand. Fearing defeat, the Spartans held the Persians back while the other Greek forces retreated and were able to reorganize themselves further back. The Spartans' valiant sacrifice of all of the men that were there, including King Leonidas and his 300 bravest supposed Spartans, made a great impression on all the Greeks. They were killed down to the last man at Thermopylae. This is where the basis for the movie 300 comes from. So, with regards to Marathon, the Greeks won and the Persians lost. With regards to Thermopylae, the Persians win and the Greeks lose. Okay. Meanwhile, the Athenians debated how best to defend their city. Themistocles, who's an Athenian leader at this time, convinced the Athenians that the best way to protect themselves was to evacuate the city and fight at sea. They thought that the Persians were a better land army, but perhaps the Athenian navy might have an advantage. So they positioned their fleet in a really narrow channel near an island called Salamis. It was a few miles just outside of Athens on the water. They set fire to Athens, and Xerxes sent his warships to block both ends of the channel. However, the channel was really narrow, and in order to actually get to the Persian ships, he had to send his ships in to the really narrow channel. The Persian ships that were bigger had a lot more difficulty in turning, and the smaller Greek ships, which were armed with battering rams, were able to attack, puncture the hulls of many of the Persian ships, and Xerxes watched in horror as more than 1/3 of his fleet was sunk. He faced another defeat in 479 BC when the Greeks crushed the Persian army at the Battle of Plataea. After this major setback, the Persians were always on the defensive. The following year, several Greek city-states formed an alliance called the Delian League. The alliance took its name from Delos, which was an island in the Aegean Sea, which was where it was headquartered. League members continued to press the war against the Persians for several more years, but in time they drove the Persians from the territory surrounding Greece and ended the threat of future attacks. Some consequences of the Persian Wars. With the Persian threat ended, all the Greek city-states felt a new sense of confidence and freedom. Athens, in particular, basked in the glory of the Persians' defeat. And during the 470s, Athens emerged as the leader of this new Delian League, which had grown to some 200 city-states being represented by it. Soon thereafter, though, Athens began to use its power to control the other league members. It moved the league headquarters to Athens and used military force against members that challenged its authority. In time, these city-states become little more than provinces of a really vast Athenian empire, and the prestige of victory over the Persians and the wealth of the Athenian empire set the stage for this really dazzling burst of creativity in Athens. The city itself entered a really brief golden age, but just like many others that emerge as powerful, it also grew the number of enemies that they had. Okay, we're going to end with video telling part of the story again. Okay.
Really? Already? All right. An open letter. Stan! To Aristophanes. Dear Aristophanes. Oh, right, I have to check the secret compartment. Stan, what? Oh. Thank you, Stan. It's fake dog poo. Louis, what we're really thinking about is Athens in the 4th century BCE, right after the Persian Wars. But Greece was way more than Athens. Greeks lived in city-states, which consisted of a city and its surrounding area. Most of these city-states featured at least some form of slavery, and in all of them, citizenship was limited to males. Sorry, ladies. Also, each of these city-states had its own form of government, ranging from very democratic, unless you were a woman or a slave, to completely dictatorial. And the people who lived in these cities considered themselves citizens of that city, not of anything that would ever be called Greece. At least until the Persian Wars. So between 490 and 480 BCE, the Persians made war on the Greek city-states. This was the war that featured the Battle of Thermopylae, where 300 brave Spartans battled, if you believe Herodotus, 5 million Persians, and also the Battle of Marathon, which is a plain about 26.2 miles away from Athens. The whole war started because Athens supported those aforementioned Ionian Greeks when they were rebelling in Anatolia against the Persians. That made the Persian king Xerxes mad, so he led 2 major campaigns against the Athenians, and the Athenians enlisted the help of all the other Greek city-states. In the wake of that shared Greek victory, the Greeks began to see themselves as Greeks rather than as Spartans or Athenians or whatever. And then Athens emerged as the de facto capital of Greece and then got to experience a golden age, which is something that historians make up. But a lot of things did happen during the golden age, including the Parthenon, a temple that became a church and then a mosque and then an armory until finally settling into its current gig as a ruin. You also had statesmen like Pericles, whose famous funeral oration brags about the golden democracy of Athens with rhetoric that wouldn't sound out of place today. If we look to the laws, they afford equal justice to all in their private differences. If a man is able to serve the state, he is not hindered by the obscurity of his condition, and when you combine that high-minded rhetoric with the undeniable power and beauty of the art and philosophy that was created in ancient Athens, it's not hard to see it as the foundation of Western civilization. And if you buy into this, you have to be glad that the Greeks won the Persian Wars. But even if you put aside the slavery and other injustices in Greek society, there's still trouble. Do I have to say it? Seriously? Fine. Trouble. Right here in River City with a capital T, and that rhymes with P, and that stands for Peloponnese. Pericles' funeral oration comes from a later war, the Peloponnesian War, which was a 30-year conflict between the Athenians and the Spartans. The Spartans did not embrace democracy, but instead embraced a kingship that functioned only because of a huge class of brutally mistreated slaves. But to be clear, the war was not about Athens trying to get Sparta to embrace democratic reform. Wars rarely are. It was about resources and power, and the Athenians were hardly saintly in all of this, as evidenced by the famous Melian dialogue. Let's go to the thought bubble. So in one of the most famous passages of Thucydides' history of the Peloponnesian War, the Athenians sailed to the island of Melos, a Spartan colony, and demanded that the Melians submit to Athenian rule. The Melians pointed out that they'd never actually fought with the Spartans and were like, listen, if it's all the same to you, we'd like to go Switzerland on this one, except of course they didn't say that because there was no Switzerland, to which the Athenians responded, and here I am quoting directly, "The strong do what they can, and the weak suffer what they must." Needless to say, this is not a terribly democratic or enlightened position to take. This statement, in fact, is sometimes seen as the first explicit endorsement of the so-called theory of realism in international relations. For realists, interaction between nations or peoples or cultures is all about who has the power. Whoever has it can compel whoever doesn't have it to do pretty much anything. So what did the meritocratic and democratic Athenians do when the Melians politely asked not to participate in the fight? They killed all the Melian men and enslaved all the women and children. So yes, Socrates gave us his interrogative method, Sophocles gave us Oedipus, but the legacy of ancient Greece is profoundly ambiguous. All the more so because the final winner of the Peloponnesian War were the dictatorial Spartans. Thanks for the incredible bummer, Thought Bubble. So here's a non-rhetorical question. Did the right side win the Persian Wars? Most classicists and defenders of the Western tradition will tell you that, of course, we should be glad the Greeks won. After all, winning the Persian War set off the cultural flourishing that gave us the classical age. And plus, if the Persians had won with their monarchy, they might have strangled democracy in its crib and gave us more one-man rule. And that's possible, but as a counter to that argument, let's consider three things. First, it's worth remembering that life under the Persians was pretty good, and if you look at the last 5,000 years of human history, you'll find a lot more successful and stable empires than you will democracies. Second, life under the Athenians wasn't so awesome, particularly if you were a woman or a slave, and their government was notoriously corrupt. And ultimately, the Athenian government derived its power not from its citizens, but from the imperialist belief that might makes right. It's true that Athens gave us Socrates, but let me remind you, they also killed him. Well, I mean, they forced him to commit suicide. Whatever, Herodotus, you're not the only one here who can engage in historical bias. And lastly, under Persian rule, the Greeks might have avoided the Peloponnesian War, which ended up weakening the Greek city-states so much that Alexander, coming soon, the Great's father, was able to conquer all of them, and then there were a bunch of bloody wars with the Persians, and all kinds of horrible things, and Greece wouldn't glimpse democracy again for 2 millennia, all of which might have been avoided if they had just let themselves get beaten by the Persians. All of which forces us to return to the core question of human history. What's the point of being alive? I've got good news for you, Guy. You're only going to have to worry about it for about 8 more seconds. Should we try to ensure the longest, healthiest, and most productive lives for humans? If so, it's easy to argue that Greece should have lost the Persian Wars. But perhaps lives are supposed to be lived in pursuit of some great ideal worth sacrificing endlessly for. And if so, maybe the glory of Athens still shines, however dimly. Those are the real questions of history. What's the point of being alive? How should we organize ourselves? What should we seek from this life? Those aren't easy questions, but we'll take another crack at them next week when we talk about the Buddha. I'll see you then. Crash Course is